From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's today's lineup. Two topics that were addressed at K-State's 2020 Risk and Profit Conference last week. From the IGP Institute here at K-State, Guy Allen will offer his perspectives on the current state of international grain trade and the main factors influencing U.S. grain sales prospects abroad. And K-State's Mykel Taylor covering a new survey of Kansas farm landowners and tenants on preferences in farmland leasing arrangements. She'll talk about how each party's approach to risk affects the type of lease agreed upon. Further ahead then, K-State's Charlie Lee will tell of a new Nebraska study of coyote behavior as captured by trail cameras. All that and more next on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
While the CDC urges you to avoid close contact, like hugging or shaking hands, there are other non-physical ways to say hello. Wave, wink, use sign language, salute, smile, give the peace sign, throw up an air high five, do jazz hands. Remember, stay a minimum of 6 feet or 2 arms length away from others and stay home if you can. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Thanks for tuning in once again for another Agriculture Today. Well, we're going to draw up more notes from that recent Risk and Profit Conference hosted by K-State Agricultural Economics online last week. One of the sessions designated there was on international agricultural trade, grain, and some talk as well about meat imports and exports likewise. And contributing to that heavily, our guest now. He's the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University. Guy Allen is back with us. So, Guy, you teamed up with Dan O'Brien to talk over the markets and trade. And let's start by talking about the general highlights on corn, soybeans, and wheat.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Yes, I always like to take a quick spin around the world and see what the current issues are driving these markets. There's some fairly significant macro drivers out there. First and forefront is the impact of this COVID-19 situation. And as we're all quite aware, we've seen various disruptions across the supply chains, definitely impacting the demand side of things. And that's true not only here in the U.S., but internationally as well. In the wake of that, we're looking at a global recession, significant drop in GDP, per capita disposable income, and that's changing consumers' buying habits. And what we're trying to figure out as an economist, is that just a temporary change, or are we going to see a shift in the demand curve that's going to be a bit longer lasting than just COVID? Looking at us up front in the next couple months, we're looking at taking off a record corn and soybean crop here in the U.S., and we're also looking at record global production of both coarse grains and oil seeds, and that's hanging over the market in a very, very big way. However, we're also forecasting record consumption. With these lower prices, it's pricing in significant demand, and that demand is being driven particularly by the animal agriculture side for the production of meat, milk, eggs, poultry, and a number of products there. But I think that demand's going to be more backloaded towards the end of the year. With the price structures that we're seeing at the moment with big carries in the marketplace, most of our end users are going hand to mouth, not only domestically but also internationally. So we're going to have to see that demand build through the season, and that means it's going to be third, fourth quarter before we see, I think, any meaningful potential price rally from the strong demand situation. One thing that I think is very important to watch, particularly from a U.S. perspective, it gets to be ignored once in a while, is the strength in the U.S. currency. That's in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen significant strength in the U.S. dollar, particularly with the global economic situation. We see a flight to safety, and that's generally in U.S. dollars, which has added strength. However, in the last few weeks, we have seen a bit of weakness in the U.S. dollar, but I just really need to remind everyone, particularly when you look at our competing producers globally, Brazil and Argentina, they have a record low Brazilian real, Argentine peso, and that's making their commodities look very, very high priced to their domestic producers. Also, for a lot of our major buyers, with their weaker currency, for imported products, it's looking very, very expensive. We also have issues issues. Most immediate is this U.S.-China trade relationship. They were supposed to have a meeting just this weekend, and that got postponed a bit indefinitely. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. China continues to come to the marketplace on a daily basis for purchasing fairly significant tonnages of commodities. And as long as they stay on that trend, I think that'll continue to reinforce the market that we do have a sustained demand coming in from China particularly. We're also negotiating trade agreements with the U.K. I think that has as much to do with the capital markets and the strength of the U.S. dollar, how that comes out. I think we're going to see and have been seeing flight of capital out of both the EU, European Union, as well as the financial markets in London coming into the U.S. We're also, let's not forget, some other bilateral agreements that we're negotiating at the moment. Kenya is high on that list, as well as there's some discussions with India, which is always a hard nut to crack. And then we're continually looking at Latin America and those trade relationships as well. And I'm increasingly confident that we're going to work these deals out and make that a lot more friendly environment to do business in.
So that's a sweeping summary of what's going on trade-wise around the world. But again, Guy, it always seems to come back to the headliner being our trade relationships and dealings with the People's Republic of China because of the magnitude of that market. And you've put together some bullet points, if you will, on where it stands in terms of its needs, how the U.S. might fill its needs. One of the things that China's got to consider is its state of food security, and several things have happened in that realm, you say.
Yes, just again last week, President Xi highlighted the top issue in China is food security, and it's been that way for, since the 1930s, 40s. You know, when you've got 1.3 to 1.4 billion people to feed every day, the quickest way to have a change of government is to have a bunch of hungry people. So food security has always been at the top priorities of the Chinese government. With the flooding situation we're seeing along the Yangtze and some recent storms that came through more northern China, that's disrupting their supply chain, threatened a bit of their food production. Trying to quantify that is quite difficult. I think last week I would have said it's more threatening their rice production than their corn. And it's also disrupting the logistics on trying to deliver those commodities. The movement itself. You got to remember there's a lot of product that moves up and down that Yangtze River as it discharges in Shanghai up to the inland of the country. That's flooded. The flooding has also taken out some railroads and some bridges and just really complicated their supply chain issues in trying to deliver that. It's also had an impact of further spreading the African swine fever situation and keeping that under control. Just this past month, we've seen first indications that China's starting to rebuild the herd slightly, but I think the impacts of this flooding could stymie that for a bit more. In as far as the Chinese economy, broadly speaking here, with the impacts of COVID considered and other elements in this mix, is that economy coming back, though? Yeah, we're starting to see some green shoots, if you call it, or indications that the economy is starting to recover from the COVID situation. Their unemployment numbers were down slightly just in the month of June. Last week, we saw China announce some increases in year-on-year trade and export volumes. I know particularly they're importing a bit more iron ore and coal, which that's a good indication that they're starting to gear up their manufacturing again. So just good signals that economy is starting to recover. I'd also suggest that means internationally people are starting to buy finished goods and products again. You know, a lot of manufactured products come out of China. So it's those sort of macro things that we tend to watch. And then it directly relates back to disposable income and food consumption as well. So when one looks at China's agricultural industries, where they stand, you mentioned the hog herd and its rebuilding, but there are other sectors, particularly in the meats sector, that bear watching too, in as far as potentially exporting either meat or feed grains into that country. Yes, I always sort of look at meat and animal products as being concentrated feed grains, being a grain trader myself. But yeah, just looking at the meat prices recently in China, we've seen pork prices particularly rally back up to close to where they were a few months ago, to their historic highs. People ask, why do you pay so much attention to the pork price in China? Well, 60% of the world's hogs sit in China, and there's a direct relationship, high correlation between the price of pigs in China and their consumer price index. So much so that the locals in China refer to the consumer price index as the consumer pork index. They're so closely related. However, in the wake of the last 2 months, we've seen a 40% drop in Chinese imports of U.S. pork. And we have the supplies there ready to go. Price indications are telling us that it should be moving that direction, but it's not. Yep.
And the explanation is still out in the ether somewhere?
Well, I think it's always important to remember that on the surface, China, a lot of people look at China as a market-based economy, but it's certainly not. You know, there's always that invisible hand of the Chinese government there, and if needed, they'll exert pressure, and they control it by the issuance of import permits or not. And I think they're playing a fairly long political game there. And the thing we have to remember is China is always very, very good at playing the long game. They're always very, very patient on that. I think our trade representatives are quite aware of that, so it's a bit of a chess game or poker game on how they manage that through. But at the end of the day, I don't see China going away from purchases, particularly of agricultural commodities. One thing that we focus on quite regularly is the carryover stocks of corn. 60%, nearly two-thirds of the world ending stocks are sitting in China. That's about just under 200 million metric tons of corn sitting there for ending stocks. Some of my close contacts in China are actually suggesting it could be as low as 50 million metric tons. Well, if it's down as low as 50 million metric tons, that could be a very market-moving event. So, yes, I think China needs those supply of grain and corn particularly, as well as soybeans and other commodities, and they will come to the U.S. to buy that.
Well, lots going on in the world trade scene, as is always the case, Guy, and you summarized this very nicely at Risk and Profit, and we always appreciate you coming over, passing along some of these thoughts to us. We'll have you back again soon. Many thanks to you.
Thank you, Eric.
Guy Allen with us. Once again, he was a presenter at that conference virtually last week. He is the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University. Guy's been our guest on this part of Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
You're listening to Agriculture Today, and up for you now, information that was passed along at that recent Risk and Profit Conference online, hosted by the Agricultural Economics Department here at Kansas State University. One of the featured topics is what we'll get into now. The state of farmland leasing arrangements and some things that our guest and her research colleague have discovered upon a survey which was conducted with farmers and landlords alike. Mykel Taylor is with us, agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension. Now, Mykel, you're an old hand at this topic of farmland leases and the arrangements that tenants and landlords make, but you've taken a look at this with a fresh perspective lately. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm working with a PhD student, Chelsea Arnold, and she and I put together a survey that went out last year, and the way the survey worked was we sent it to KFMA farmers and then asked them to send it on to their landlords, which is kind of unique. Normally, all of our surveys go directly to farmers, and that's who we try to glean information from. In this case, we also wanted to get some information from the folks that they lease from. And when it came back, we had about 180 matched pairs of landlords and tenants. And that really allows us to kind of dig a little deeper into the landlord-tenant relationship and how we come to these agreements on whether they're cash leases or crop share leases or flex leases, and understanding a little bit more about them.
So it was more than just taking inventory on the types of leases in play out there.
Right. We asked quite a few questions, including, what their crop rotation was, so we could better understand, what their production practices were. We asked some questions of the landlords and the tenants about their risk preferences, so their willingness to take on risk, which was a self-assessment question. And then we asked a lot of demographic questions and characteristics of their leases. What we find is that some of those characteristics have had influences on the risk preferences of the landlord and the tenant, and some of those characteristics have influences. They sort of manifest their preferences for risk or their risk exposure. And so we actually wanted to learn a little bit more about that.
To set a baseline, we probably should talk about the types of leases that are predominant out there. Has anything changed in that respect?
Well, the dominant leases are crop share, where you share the crop and you share some of the input costs. The second one is a fixed cash lease, where you just paid a flat amount for leasing your ground. And then the third is a flex lease, which is a hybrid between the two, between a crop share and a cash lease. And it tends to have a baseline cash lease to it, and then it flexes on either production prices or revenue. So those are the three different kinds. And one of the things that we've seen is we know with flex leases is that's a very small percentage of the overall number. It's about anywhere between, depending on the survey, between 2 and 5% of the leases are flex leases. We know that they're pretty complex and hard to negotiate to get all the details to where everybody's happy. So they don't tend to happen very often. On the crop share and the fixed cash leases, which are the ones we see the most, we see probably about 60% crop share and about 30% cash, and of the residuals. From 2002 to 2011, we had seen an increase in the proportion of fixed cash leases, so they were becoming more and more common. People were attributing that to, we were having some good profitability years and farmers were being very competitive, and it was easier to be competitive on a fixed cash lease than it was on a crop share. And so you were seeing a lot more fixed cash leases. Well, between 2011 and 2016, we actually saw that percentage of fixed cash leases drop by about 5%. And so we've seen a shift back towards the crop share arrangement. And that, I think, is coming from greater variability in profits during that period and a desire on the part of tenants to share some of that risk of profitability variation with their landlords. And there must be a willingness on the part of landlords to do that in order for them to come to an agreement that they're going to switch from a fixed cash lease to a crop share.
But to sift down a bit more here, and you mentioned the risk factor as one of those determining the choice of lease type that the parties would enter into. You found some quite interesting things along that line in this recent survey.
Right. So in this recent survey, what we were trying to do was figure out how contract choice was a function of things like risk preferences of landlords and tenants and just the overall variability of profits. And what you find is that the more variability in profit that you have, the more likely you are to go to a crop share, which is arguably, it's borne out in the survey results, and we see it in other areas where we've seen the proportion of fixed cash leases drop. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is the risk preferences of the landlords and the tenants and how those two compare. And previous research has just made the assumption that all landlords are the same as the farmers because they tend to be retired farmers, therefore they have the same risk preferences. Well, there's a couple of kind of common sense things that would tell you that landlords might very well have different risk preferences than their tenant. And it could be, number one, that they're not a retired farmer, so they look at the risk from farming differently than a tenant does. And number two is that as you age, your risk preferences for income could change as well, especially if you go on to a fixed income situation, which a lot of landlords are. The average age of a landowner in Kansas is about 70. So typically retired folks. And for some of them, having consistency of income from that land is important. So their risk preferences might have changed as well.
And your study affirmed those previous thoughts?
Yes, it did. What we found was that as the landlord becomes more risk averse, they're going to have a tendency towards a fixed cash lease. And as the tenant becomes more risk loving, they are going to move towards a crop share. What's hard to keep track of, so we put this in the context of a situation out in western Kansas where you would have a LEMA, Limited Enhanced Management Area. Yes. I have trouble with that one. But what it basically means is that they're self-regulating the use of their water, and they're not putting as much water on their crops as they were before the LEMA went into place. And with irrigated crops, if you put on less water, that means you're more exposed to weather and the variability of rainfall. So the variability in yield is going to go up. Therefore, the variability in profits is going to go up. So this greater risk exposure with less water application says, well, maybe these tenant farmers and landlords are going to want to switch to a crop share, and that's what we find. So that was the application was in a LEMA situation. But I think that given that our summary statistics statewide say that we're moving away from those fixed cash leases, says that just any kind of profit variability, whether it's coming from prices or trade or COVID or any of these different sources that we experience, is going to have an impact on potential leasing contract arrangements.
But that irrigation scenario that you just described gets at one of the other important components of your report, and that is that output variability, crop output.
Right.
That is a huge driver in this.
Right. Rule of thumb is that you're going to see more fixed cash leases on irrigated ground because you have less variability in output. And then you're going to have more of a mix of contracts on non-irrigated land because it's going to be driven more by risk preferences. And so that's what we found, was that as you move away from that more consistent output in yield, you're going to prefer a crop share.
So you and your colleague have put together this updated profile of leasing arrangements for Kansas farm ground. How do you hope this will be valuable to producers, to lenders, and the other interested parties out there, Mykel?
Well, what I have learned, and I don't want to sound like a psychologist versus an economist, but what I've learned is that leasing relationship is just fundamentally incredibly important to the overall business success of farms. Fully half of an average farm is leased ground, which means that anywhere between 40 and 50% of your acres are going to be owned by someone else, and your business relationship with them is going to drive whether or not you still have that land next year. And we want to minimize the risk of you not having that land next year. So studying leasing relationships might seem a little bit peripheral to ag economics and ag business, but it really comes down to being one of the more fundamental business relationships that farmers have to manage. And so the more that we can help them understand how those relationships work and what are the fundamentals to it, I think the better off we can be. And we at K-State Research and Extension get a lot of questions from landlords wanting to, know how to manage their land and how to work with farmers. And so we're really educating both sides of that relationship. And I think that's where this research can be valuable, is not just helping farmers, but also helping their landowners to better understand what's going on.
Well, there is much, much more to the analysis that you and Chelsea Arnold put together, as was reported at the Risk and Profit Conference. So you've posted all of that online for folks to review, have you not?
Yes, that will be available on agmanager.info.
Very well. Be looking for that, and it's very insightful information on cropland leasing arrangements in Kansas and where they stand as of 2020. And we appreciate the word on this, Mykel. As always, thanks for coming over.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for letting me be here.
Agricultural economist Mykel Taylor, K-State Research and Extension. You're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to the K-State Radio Network, and welcome back to Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and now to today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. This week's Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report from the USDA reads like this. For the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture in the state was at 4% surplus, 72% adequate, and 24% short to very short. Subsoil moisture at 5% surplus, 70% adequate, and 25% short to very short. Kansas corn crop condition this week at 63% good to excellent, 25% fair, 12% poor to very poor. Corn now in the dough stage at 81%, dented at 40%, and mature corn now at 1% around the state. The soybean crop condition in Kansas regressed ever so slightly this past week. Still, 69% good to excellent, 25% fair, 6% poor to very poor. Soybeans blooming at 90%, setting pods at 73%, and beans dropping leaves now at 1%. And grain sorghum in the state, 68% good to excellent, 25% fair, 7% poor to very poor, with sorghum headed at 79% and sorghum turning color at 17%. Range and pasture conditions in the state at 55% good to excellent, 32% fair, and 13% poor to very poor this week. Now, a 10 percentage point decline in the Iowa corn crop's good to excellent condition rating following last Monday's derecho contributed to a 2-point drop in the national corn condition rating overall last week, according to the USDA. NASS is estimating that 69% of the nation's corn crop was in good to excellent condition as of Sunday, down 2% from last week, still tied for the fourth highest rating in 10 years. Like corn, soybean conditions nationally also fell last week, USDA estimating that 72% of the nation's soybean crop is in good to excellent shape as of this past Sunday. That's down 2 percentage points from last week, but still tied for the third highest rating in at least 10 years. President Trump has approved Iowa's request for an expedited disaster declaration following last week's devastating derecho that inflicted damage to crops, to grain storage, and other agriculture infrastructure. Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds on Sunday had requested a presidential major disaster declaration, requesting about $4 billion in federal assistance. And on Friday, the USDA's Risk Management Agency reported that 57 Iowa counties were in the path of the storm, where an estimated 14 million acres of insured crops may have been affected. That includes 8 million acres of corn and 5.5 million acres of soybeans. Iowa Secretary of Agriculture Mike Negg released more details on potential crop damage, saying that 36 counties in Iowa were hardest hit by the derecho. Going on to say within those 36 counties, the storm likely had the greatest impact on 3.5 million acres of corn and 2.5 million acres of beans. The Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship estimates hundreds of millions of bushels of commercial grain storage and tens of millions of bushels of on-farm storage were lost in the storm. The president can declare a major disaster declaration for any natural event that he believes has caused damage of such severity that's beyond the combined capabilities of state and local governments to respond. And the disaster declaration said that 8,200 homes were also destroyed or had major damage. In addition, the governor there estimated $23.5 million of damage occurring to the public infrastructure, with an additional $21.5 million in costs with removal and disposal of storm debris. Next for you on Agriculture Today, this week's Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today, I'd like to talk to our Kansas dairy producers concerning what we might be seeing as far as somatic cell counts on our dairy farms. As we approach kind of the end of summer here, a lot of times we see an increase in the somatic cell count on our dairies. While this currently isn't alarming, we just normally see this general rise in somatic cell count. So some of you may be looking at your numbers and you may be saying, so why is this happening? Well, there's several different reasons and things that you may want to check on your dairy. Number one, probably you're seeing a lower level of overall milk production in your dairy herd. This probably causes a bit of the rise, but it's not the only cause, and it's probably not the major cause. One of the major causes is probably just an increase in the mastitic organisms that your animals are exposed to in the environment in which they live. During the summertime, with warmer weather and humidity, these organisms multiply much easier. Therefore, when an animal lays down in a wet area to escape heat stress, there's a good chance that they may pick up some of those organisms. The other thing that we sometimes forget about during the summer is the hair on the udders. Are you still trimming the hair from the udders or singeing or removing it in other ways? A lot of times we don't have as much growth in the summertime, obviously, as we do in the winter, but it's still there, and it attracts dirt, and dirt attracts flies. When we combine dirt and flies together, we see an increase in the mastitic organisms that naturally exist in the environment. They're just a lot closer to the teat ends now. Another thing to consider is, do you trim the tail hair on your animals? Why would that be important in the summer? Well, in the summer, obviously cows tend to lay in wetter areas. The switch gets wet, and then when she stands up, she starts beating back the flies. As she beats back the flies, she also spreads manure, or whatever was on her tail while she was laying down, to her backside and around the udder. And again, this increases the attraction to the flies. So the cleanliness of the rear udder is actually really important to successful mastitis control during the summer. And along with that, fly control. A lot of times as fly populations build during the summer, again, we have an attraction around the teat ends for the flies, and as a result of that, we can see an increase in somatic cell counts. The final thing you need to think about is, in the summertime, sometimes we get a little bit lax on our milking procedures, and maybe we have a lot of different people that are actually doing the milking compared to the rest of the year. Are these people properly trained? Are they following the procedures that you would like used on your farm? Again, lack of compliance with these procedures could be a major issue on your farm. These are just a few of the things you might want to evaluate. If you're seeing an increase in somatic cell on your dairy farm, my guess is if you carefully evaluate each of these items, you'll probably find some of the issues that are causing your increase in somatic cell. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to carefully evaluate the somatic cell counts of their dairy herd and the causes if they're seeing a rise.
Thanks, Mike. And this is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Topping off this Agriculture Today, it's our weekly segment on wildlife management. Aboard once more is wildlife specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension. Well, Charlie, you tell us you'll review a study today just out, and it looks at trail camera detection of coyotes. And these devices have been used for this purpose for a while, haven't they?
Yes. As biologists are always interested in the best ways to monitor wildlife populations, that requires some method of counting numbers of animals that are out there. And camera traps have now become more advanced, less expensive. They're very commonly used, and it's a very cost-effective method of monitoring wildlife populations. You can collect data over a large area with very few people and over an extended length of time. They're also much less invasive to wildlife movement and behavior because you're not having humans in that environment, which may alter animal behavior over the time of the study. From 1998 to 2008, the number of published studies using camera traps grew fivefold. So they're certainly becoming more frequently used and often are used to predict the abundance and distribution of wildlife populations. However, there are some limitations to the use of camera traps to monitor populations. You always have issues with photo resolution, the settings on the camera, which may impact trigger, Have you got the camera placed in the right location to capture images? Sunlight, vegetation in front of the camera lens, all of those can impact your detection rates. So this was a study that was done and published in the Wildlife Society Bulletin this summer on the use of camera traps to monitor coyote numbers. The study area was 24 counties in the western one-third of Nebraska, a very large area. They captured over 5 million photographs from 800 scent-lured camera traps during this study over the years of 2014 and 2015. The motion cameras that were used were Bushnell Trophy Cam HD as well as Moultrie M880s. Those camera traps were used over 4 field seasons. The locations for those traps were selected on the basis of fences, minor roads, intersections, or other suspected areas where coyotes may travel so that they could increase the detection probability. There was approximately 12-inch high stake that the camera was mounted on, and then there was some lure, which was pure skunk essence and petroleum jelly, put on the top of that wooden stake. That was the attractor or the lure to get coyotes to come over within range of the camera.
And again, capturing some 5 million images, so this was an extensive sample size, if you will. One of the things you say that they were most interested in here was how weather conditions would impact coyote behavior.
Yeah, they looked at weather and they looked at behavior, and they found that the detection probability decreased exponentially as the exposure period increased. So coyotes were at least interested in the lure early on, but that was a marked decrease after that first 24-hour period. That's kind of surprising to me as someone that's trapped coyotes for a few years, in that skunk essence is a commonly used lure, and I had always thought that it persisted for a long period of time and would perhaps maintain its ability to get a coyote to respond to that particular location. But with that many images and over that many different locations, it's hard to argue with their data. I've always suspected that the first night or two after setting traps, coyote response may have been lower because of the human scent left around that particular trap. But in this particular study, they found that that first 24-hour period was when coyote numbers peaked with the use of that particular lure. There is also the air temperature, wind speed, and barometric pressure, all caused a response in coyote behavior or coyote movement patterns. Those indicated that as air temperature decreased, coyotes were detected more frequently, probably because of increased energy demands in lower temperature conditions. The coyote had to increase his foraging and thus his movement, which would translate into more images being captured. There was also a positive correlation with barometric pressure, so that suggested that coyotes were using barometric pressure perhaps to predict precipitation. Precipitation tended to decrease coyote activity. Wind speed decreased coyote detection rates. They suggested that that was due to wind interfering with the dispersal of the lure and interfering with the coyote's ability to use their sense of smell to hunt, because it is largely a predator that hunts not only by sight but also by the use of smell, and that high winds would decrease the dispersal of that skunk lure.
So quite a variety of findings here. How would you think this information could be of aid to coyote monitoring?
Well, I think that it tells me that we probably need lures that persist a little bit longer. I think we all know that extreme weather events can cause movements to differ in animals, whether that's actually due to coyote behavior or is it due to something else. In inclement weather, they have to move further to find the same amount of food, and that's when trapping conditions are often some of the best, and coyotes are more easily captured in those more severe winter conditions.
Well, this was a unique study that was recently completed in western Nebraska, and it looked at the weather effects of coyote travel, to put it that way, as captured by trail camera traps. Charlie, interesting findings indeed. Thanks for sharing all of that with us. Charlie Lee is a wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. That's our time once again. We appreciate you tuning in. Please be back with us right here tomorrow, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.